they murdered almost an additional 1,000 civilians. So the toll of the German invasion against French and Belgian civilians in 1914 approached something like 7,000 people, 6,500 to 7,000 people, and this was widely exploited by the Allied press, and therefore it got a lot of currency internationally. It was especially useful for Britain to justify British entry into the war and also to encourage voluntary recruiting in Britain, especially as the war expanded in 1915. But it wasn't just the Allies who took an interest in Belgium. Even international observers in neutral countries who were not involved in the war were interested in what was happening in Belgium, especially as far as refugees were concerned, and as refugees as well as those living under occupation in the 90% of Belgium that was under German control. And again, here there's some interesting parallels with the situation today in Ukraine because of this outpouring of sympathy from the international community that we find in both cases. So, for instance, benefactors around the world uh, established various charitable organizations which were aimed at relieving the difficulties under which Belgians were living, either Belgian refugees outside of Belgium, outside of occupied Belgium, that is, or those who were living under occupation in Belgium. A good example is the Commission for the Relief of Belgium, which was established by the American Herbert Hoover. And this organization raised all kinds of funds to supply foodstuffs um, to the people who were living in occupied Belgium. And you may say, well, how would it be possible to transmit these foodstuffs to occupied Belgium if it was under German control? But actually, because the Americans were neutral, they were up until 1917, that is, they were in a unique position to assist. And furthermore, the Germans were happy to allow the food aid to come into Belgium because that meant that there was more opportunity for the Germans to exploit agricultural output from Belgium to feed the German armies or send back to Germany. So, in essence, the supply of American foodstuffs to the Belgians under occupation was also a gift to the Germans because it relieved them of having to feed the Belgians so much because of this extra food that the Americans were making available. And of course, as the war went on, the situation became more and more difficult, particularly after the Americans were no longer neutral. That complicated the importation of food under organizations like the Commission for the Relief of Belgium. And as the Germans again suffered more and more under the Royal Naval Blockade, there was less and less left for the Belgian civilians to consume. Let's consider as well briefly the situation that unfolded in the Balkans, particularly in Serbia under the occupation of the Austro-Hungarians. And here, one of the most important collections of source material comes again from an international observer, Rodolph A. Reiss, who was actually a German-born Swiss criminologist. Reiss was actually a pioneer in many of the modern techniques of criminal investigation, including things like forensic photography and that sort of thing. I don't know very much about his background as a criminologist, but some of you who have studied criminology may have come across this character. But what Reiss did, and Reiss also was a lover of Serbia. He had a keen interest in Serb culture and Serb affairs. And in 1915, he actually volunteered to serve in the Serb army. But because of his background as a criminologist, he was enlisted by the Serb government to prepare a series of reports on crimes and atrocities which were carried out by the Austro-Hungarian occupation troops. And the reports which he wrote and had printed, were quite revealing as far as the degree to which Austro-Hungarian forces visited all kinds of violence and punishment on the Serb population. Uh, many in the international community, particularly in the Central Powers, dismissed Rice's reports as unreliable because he had an obvious bias. He was someone who had a cultural affiliation with Serbia and was even volunteering to serve in the Serb army. Uh, but I think by and large the essential details in the reports reflected more or less the reality of the situation on the ground. And here is again is where we find some interesting parallels with um, the occupations in Eastern Europe that the Germans carried out in the Second World War. Now, you may wonder, based on the international interest in the plight of the Belgians, or based on Rice's publications, which drew attention to Austro-Hungarian crimes in the Balkans and Serbia in particular, you may wonder what the moral implications were as far as prosecuting those who were responsible for some of these war crimes. But actually, in comparison with the post 1945 situation, where there were all kinds of war crimes prosecutions, we really don't see much at all happening in terms of war crimes prosecutions in the aftermath of the First World War, despite the fact that real war crimes had actually occurred. And the question is why? Why do we have this moral oversight in the case of the First World War, even if the war crimes may not have reached the same level as they did in the Second World War, either with respect to the Armenian genocide or with respect to crimes committed in Belgium or in Serbia, for example. And there were a few reasons. I'll just briefly touch on two or three. One, of course, could have to do with general exhaustion as far as the war experience was concerned, and the desire across the international community to move on into the peacetime world. But another element which comes into play was the impact of the Royal Naval Blockade enforced by Britain and the Allies throughout the war, which was responsible for the starvation of several 100,000 German civilians, particularly vulnerable children and older people. And the implications of the naval blockade could also have been construed as criminal in the context of the First World War, and because of that, there was not so much interest on the Allied side in pointing fingers at the Central Powers for their war crimes, because that may simply draw more attention to potential criminal conduct which the Allies could have been held responsible for, such as in particular the Royal Naval Blockade, which continued for a short time even after the armistice of 1918. So there were, in fact, some vested interests at play here when it came to making decisions about pursuing war crimes prosecutions when it comes to ethical and morality, and moral questions on the matter. A third factor that might have come into play was a sense by 1918 or 1919 or 1920 that perhaps there had been some wartime exaggeration about the extent of crimes in occupied territories. And it was true that press reports during the war, particularly in the Belgian case, did tend to distort some of the details of the German crimes, especially those of 1914 and 15. And be that as it may, crimes did actually occur. Murders of Belgian civilians did actually occur, even if the press reports were sensationalized and not exactly accurate in terms of their detail. They were essentially true, if not true in terms of detail, but nevertheless, that sensational press reporting led some observers to conclude that maybe there was all smoke and no fire in this case. So again, this helps to explain why we don't see much in the way of war crimes prosecutions after 1918. So when it comes to occupation in the Second World War, we can find some broad parallels with the First World War, and then some key differences. Um, Overall, the the experience of occupation in the Second World War is far more complex than in the First World War, simply because the conflict is spread over a larger geographical area, and the extent of territory which is occupied, both in terms of surface area and in terms of populations which live in those occupied territories, is rather larger and generally of longer duration than what we find in the case studies that we've looked at in the First World War. I'm going to make no attempt here, because time doesn't permit, to give an overview of all of the different experiences of occupation in the Second World War. First, I just want to make a few general remarks, and then what I want to do is switch gears a little bit and look at some of the moral questions that arose and that continue to present themselves when it comes to how occupation could be challenged in the case of the Second World War. In other words, some of the moral questions that arise when one attempts to resist occupation or to undermine the occupation authorities. Now, we didn't talk about this so much in the case of the First World War, because compared to the Second World War, there were very few examples of open resistance to occupation in the First World War. Most instances of resistance, if we can even find them in the First World War, were sort of passive resistance. That is, occupied peoples did not enjoy being occupied. They didn't go out of their way to assist the occupiers. They passively resisted by simply trying to go about their daily business without offering any sort of comfort or support to the occupiers. There's very few examples in the First World War of outright active resistance against occupation. We could find some examples perhaps in the occupation of Serbia by the Central Powers, and maybe you can find some other scattered examples in different territories of the Russian Empire, which were under Central Powers occupation. But by and large, it's quite limited compared to what we find in the Second World War, where in most cases there is a whole lot more at stake than was even true in the First World War. So in summary then, the complexities of the occupation experience in the Second World War are a function of a few different variables or factors. One of these, as I've just mentioned, is the simple geographical scope of the war. You have in the Second World War, within a year of the war beginning in Europe, almost all of Western Europe and Eastern Europe under German or Axis control. Almost all of it. With the exception of Great Britain, and even some of the British Channel Islands were actually under German occupation. So there were even exceptions in the British case. France is occupied, Norway is occupied, Denmark's occupied, the Netherlands, Belgium, Poland. But as of 1941, a good portion of the Western USSR, and on it goes. So you have a very large swath of territory in Europe and in the western part of the Soviet Union under occupation, as well as in the Balkans, in southeastern Europe. For a period of time, you have the Germans as well in North Africa, although we can't really look at that so much as an occupation because they're mostly operating in Libya, which was a pre-war Italian colonial possession. But we have to consider, on top of the European theater of operations as well, what's happening in China and the Pacific. And actually, China is arguably the first country to come under foreign occupation in the broader Second World War, immediately following the Japanese invasion of 1937. So from 1937 up until 1945, a period of almost a decade, you have a far-reaching Japanese occupation of Chinese territory. We could build a whole course around that, probably, if we had the time. Plus, you have the Japanese occupation after late 1941 of many of the colonial territories in the Pacific Rim and in Southeast Asia, which had hitherto been under control of the British, Americans, French, or Dutch. And in each one of those territories, we have sort